Now, families of protesters killed in Iran have told the BBC the authorities are demanding large sums of money for the return of bodies.
Now, Iran and Russia are strengthening cooperation on multiple fronts. A strategic partnership treaty between both the countries has come into effect.
Now, Iran and Russia are expected to sign a major new strategic partnership treaty during a visit to Moscow by Iran's president.
Something sinister is happening in the silence of Tehran's palaces while the streets outside are burning. Intelligence reports confirm that a flight plan has already been filed, a route mapped, and a safe house prepared thousands of miles away. It is the ultimate escape valve for a regime that has ruled for 46 years. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who vowed never to bow to the West, reportedly has a ticket to Moscow sitting in his pocket. This is not just a rumor circulating in the bazaars. It is a specific, actionable contingency plan confirmed by Western intelligence assessments. If the security forces defect, if the final barrier breaks, Khamenei and his 20 closest associates, including his son Mojtaba, are ready to board a plane to Russia. But for Vladimir Putin, this flight is not a rescue mission. It is a death sentence for his own war here in Ukraine. Because Iran is not just a neighbor or a diplomatic partner. Iran has become the beating heart of Russia's military logistics, the factory floor for its daily air raids, and the only remaining lung for an economy choked by sanctions. If that regime falls, the shockwave will not stop at the Iranian border. It will shatter the windows of the Kremlin itself. The scale of the uprising in Iran is no longer political, it is tectonic. This is not a repeat of 2022. It is something far more final. Protests have exploded across 31 provinces simultaneously. From the Kurdish mountains in the west to the Beirut deserts in the east, the fear that once held this nation together has evaporated. Thousands of people are chanting death to Khamenei in streets that were once the regime's strongholds, and the response has been the silence of a government that knows it has lost control. They have shut down the internet and cut international phone lines, trying to blind the world to the violence. But the images are leaking out. Banners burning, security forces retreating, and a population that has nothing left to lose. The regime is cracking, and through those cracks, the world can see the terrified face of its leadership looking for an exit. But here is the terrifying reality for Moscow. They are watching their last true ally disintegrate in real time. Russia is terrified because the geopolitical dominoes are falling faster than anyone predicted. First, it was Bashar al-Assad in Syria, whose regime collapsed in December of 2024, forcing him to flee to the only capital that would take him, Moscow. Then the ground shook in South America as Nicolas Maduro's dictatorship in Venezuela was overthrown. Now, the tremors have reached Tehran. Putin is watching this sequence and realizing that his circle of friends is not just shrinking, it is vanishing. Iran is the last major regional partner Russia has left. If the Islamic Republic collapses, Russia loses its foothold in the Middle East entirely. But the loss is far more immediate and far more deadly than just influence. It is about ammunition. It is about the specific hardware that is keeping Russian soldiers alive on the Ukrainian front. The war in Ukraine runs on Iranian oxygen. That oxygen is the Shahed 136. These are not sophisticated fighter jets or hypersonic missiles. They are cheap, deadly flying lawnmowers that have changed the physics of modern warfare. In 2022, when Russia's own stockpiles began to run dry, it was Tehran that opened its warehouses. They airlifted thousands of these suicide drones to the front lines, allowing Putin to strike Ukrainian energy grids, and civilian centers without depleting his precious supply of cruise missiles. But the dependency went deeper. By 2023, Moscow and Tehran signed a massive $1.75 billion deal, not just to buy the drones, but to build the factory that makes them. That factory, located in the Alabuga Special Economic Zone in Tatarstan, is now the most critical industrial site in Russia's war effort. The numbers coming out of that facility are staggering. According to Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, Russia is now producing over 5,500 Shahed drones per month. In the year 2025 alone, Russia launched over 38,000 Iranian-designed drones at Ukrainian targets. This industrial scale has allowed Russia to adopt a brutal strategy of attrition. The math is simple and cruel. In the beginning, each drone cost Russia around $200,000 to import. Today, thanks to the blueprints and technical expertise provided by the Iranian regime, the cost of a domestically produced drone has dropped to just $70,000. This price collapse is the weapon. Russia does not care if 75% of these drones are shot down by Ukrainian air defenses. In fact, that is the point. The strategy is economic exhaustion. If Ukraine has to fire a $2 million interceptor missile to stop a $70,000 drone, Russia wins the exchange even if the drone is destroyed. They are trading cheap Iranian plastic for expensive Western interceptors, bleeding Ukraine's air defense dry one swarm at a time. All of this, the factory, the blueprints, the supply chain, the lethality, was enabled by the specific political will of the Iranian regime. If that regime disappears tomorrow, the technical experts go home. The software updates stop. The flow of new prototypes ends. The Alabuga factory might keep running for a while, but the brain trust behind it will vanish. For Putin, the collapse of Khamenei is not just a political problem, it is a logistical catastrophe that threatens to silence his guns in Ukraine. But the nightmare for Europe does not end with low-cost drones. It escalates into the realm of high-velocity destruction. The relationship between Moscow and Tehran has mutated far beyond a simple buyer-seller dynamic for loitering munitions. It has evolved into a full-scale ballistic exchange that threatens to overwhelm the continent's security architecture. Since the full-scale invasion began, Iran has transferred hundreds of ballistic missiles to Russia, a lethal inventory valued at nearly $3 billion. This is not merely a transaction, it is a strategic flooding of the battlefield. By handing over these short-range and medium-range missiles, Iran allows Russia to conserve its own dwindling stock of Iskanders and Kinjals for high-value targets, while using Iranian hardware to saturate the front lines. But there is a more sinister layer to this exchange. Iran is using the killing fields of Ukraine as a live fire testing ground for its own military ambitions. They are watching closely to see how their guidance systems hold up against American Patriot batteries and German Iris-T systems. Every missile launched at Kiev provides Tehran with terabytes of real-world data on Western air defense capabilities, data that will inevitably be used to refine future weapons aimed at Israel or U.S. bases in the Middle East. Ukraine has become the laboratory where the next generation of anti-Western terror is being perfected. The flow of lethal aid is no longer a one-way street. It has become a symbiotic loop of military acceleration. While Iranian cargo planes land in Moscow filled with Shaheds and missile components, they return to Tehran loaded with advanced Russian military technology. This is the reciprocal exchange that keeps Western intelligence agencies awake at night. In return for the drones, Russia is reportedly providing Iran with advanced fighter jets, air defense technologies, and helicopter upgrades. We are seeing the formation of a coordinated military organism where Russian raw materials and aerospace engineering merge with Iranian asymmetrical warfare tactics. This was formalized in a comprehensive 20-year strategic partnership treaty signed a year ago, covering weapons, trade, energy, and finance. In December, they added a detailed addendum specifically for military cooperation. This is not just an alliance of convenience. It is the construction of a hardened axis designed to withstand prolonged conflict with the West. Both nations have realized that they are outcasts in the current world order, so they are building a new one, a fortress where they can trade weapons and intelligence behind a wall that Western sanctions cannot penetrate. However, the most ambitious project of this new alliance is not flying through the air. It is being carved into the earth itself. Russia and Iran are currently constructing a trade corridor that could fundamentally reshape global logistics and render Western economic pressure obsolete. It is called the International North-South Transport Corridor, or INSTC. To understand the scale of this project, you have to look at the map and realize it is designed to bypass every single choke point controlled by the West or its allies. This corridor stretches 4,500 miles, starting from the freezing ports of St. Petersburg in Russia, cutting down through the Caspian Sea, traversing the entire length of Iran, and ending at the warm water ports of India, like Mumbai. It creates a direct vertical line of transit that is completely immune to European blockade. For decades, Russia's access to the global ocean has been suffocated by geography. Its ships had to pass through the Turkish Straits, navigate the Mediterranean, and squeeze through the Suez Canal. a route lined with NATO members and vulnerable to geopolitical interception. The INSTC is the jailbreak key. The mathematics of this new route are devastatingly efficient for the Kremlin. By abandoning the traditional maritime path through the Suez Canal, Russia cuts the transit distance by 40%. The cost of shipping a container drops by 30%. But the most critical metric is time. The corridor reduces the transit time between Moscow and Mumbai by up to 40% compared to the old route. This speed is capital. It means goods, oil, and raw materials move faster, cash flows quicker, and the Russian economy becomes more agile. Iranian President Pezeshkian reportedly told Vladimir Putin in January that he personally follows the progress of this project every single week. That is the level of desperation and priority attached to this artery. It is already nearly 75% complete. Last year alone, freight volumes on this route hit 27 million tons, marking a 19% increase in a single year. These are not just lines on a map. They are heavy trains and massive container ships already moving, creating a gravitational pull that is drawing Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan into this new, sanctions-proof economic orbit. But the ambition does not stop at moving shipping containers. The ultimate goal is to move energy, the lifeblood of the Russian state. Vladimir Putin has announced plans for a massive energy infrastructure project that would turn Iran into the primary distribution hub for Russian gas. The plan involves building a pipeline capable of transporting 55 billion cubic meters of gas per year. To put that number in perspective, it rivals the capacity of the now destroyed Nord Stream pipelines that once fed Germany. But this gas is not meant for Iranian consumers. Iran already sits on the second largest gas reserves in the world and has no need for Russian imports. Instead, the strategy is to pump Russian gas down through the safety of the Iranian corridor and then sell it to customers in the global south, potentially piping it through to Pakistan and India. It is a masterstroke of energy laundering. By mixing Russian molecules with Iranian infrastructure, they create a product that is harder to track and harder to sanction. Russia is effectively building a backdoor to the global energy market, one that does not require permission from Brussels or Washington. For the United States, this corridor is a geopolitical disaster unfolding in slow motion. Newsweek reports that Washington is watching the development of the INSTC with extreme concern because it fundamentally undermines the mechanics of economic warfare. The entire theory of sanctions is based on the idea that the West controls the financial and logistical bottlenecks of the world. If you can stop a ship from insuring in London or docking in Rotterdam, you can strangle an economy. But the Russia-Iran corridor operates entirely outside of this jurisdiction. It uses Russian and Iranian railways, Caspian Sea shipping lanes, and Indian Ocean ports. It creates a closed loop where the dollar is irrelevant, and Western navies have no legal authority to interdict trade. For Iran, this is a massive power play. It transforms the country from a pariah state into the indispensable bridge connecting the Eurasian landmass to the Indian Ocean. It gives Tehran transit fees, leverage over Moscow, and a central role in the economy of the future. But all of these grand designs, the pipelines, the railways, the drone factories, rest on one fragile foundation: the survival of the regime in Tehran. Beyond the steel of the railways and the concrete of the pipelines, there is a desperate financial gamble taking place, one that binds the fate of the Russian economy directly to the stability of the Iranian rial. Iran is more than just a transit zone for Moscow. It has become one of the last remaining investment frontiers for a Kremlin that has been locked out of London, New York, and Frankfurt. In 2022, Russia's energy giant Gazprom signed a memorandum of understanding with the national Iranian oil company worth a staggering $40 billion. This was not a standard business transaction, it was a financial lifeline thrown between two drowning swimmers. Gazprom pledged to pour this massive sum into developing Iranian oil and gas fields, aiming to revitalize a sector that had been decaying under decades of American sanctions, while simultaneously securing a return on investment that Western markets now deny them. This initial promise was followed by concrete action. As recently as 2025, the two isolated nations signed another $4 billion deal specifically for oil field development. The logic driving these investments is brutal but simple. Russia and Iran are the two most sanctioned nations on Earth. They have been forced into a corner where they must cannibalize each other's markets to survive. creating an economic ecosystem where if one collapses, the other loses billions in sunk costs overnight. But the anxiety in the Kremlin goes far deeper than lost dollars or canceled contracts. It is rooted in the terrifying realization that the club of autocrats is facing an extinction event. Vladimir Putin is looking at a map of the world that is rapidly changing color, and the trend is catastrophic for Russian interests. Just think about what has been erased from Moscow's strategic ledger in the last few years. In December of 2024, the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria finally crumbled. For over a decade, Russia had poured blood and treasure into keeping Assad on his throne to secure a Mediterranean port and a foothold in the Levant. That investment has now evaporated. Then, the shockwaves crossed the Atlantic, and the dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, another staunch Russian ally in the Western Hemisphere, was overthrown. Now, the crosshairs have settled on Tehran. Putin is watching these dominoes fall one by one, and he is doing the math. If Iran's regime follows Assad and Maduro into the dustbin of history, Russia will be left completely alone in a hostile world. It will lose its last major partner in the Middle East, its weapons supplier, and its strategic buffer. The geopolitical isolation that the West has tried to engineer for years would finally be complete. The potential collapse of the Islamic Republic brings an even darker specter to the doorstep of the Kremlin, the resurrection of historic rivalries. We often forget that Russia and Iran are not natural friends. They are ancient imperial competitors. For centuries, the Russian Tsars and the Persian Shahs fought for dominance over the Caucasus and Central Asia. It is only their shared hatred of the United States that has glued them together in recent years. If a new pro-Western or even neutral government were to rise from the ashes of the current regime in Tehran, that glue would dissolve instantly. A free Iran would likely pivot back to its natural economic interests, which lie with Europe and Asia, not with a sanctioned pariah state like Russia. Suddenly, Moscow would face a competitor in the energy markets rather than a partner. Iranian oil and gas would flood the global market, driving down prices and slashing the revenue that funds Putin's war machine. Strategically, Russia would find itself encircled, with a hostile NATO to the west and a resurgent, uncooperative Iran to the south. This is the nightmare scenario, the complete strategic encirclement of the Russian Federation. There is also a psychological contagion that terrifies Vladimir Putin more than any NATO expansion. The Russian president knows that revolutions are infectious. They send a signal that penetrates borders and censorship firewalls. If the Iranian people, ordinary citizens, students, workers, succeed in toppling a militarized, entrenched theocracy through sheer persistence and street protests, it sends a thunderous message to the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg. It proves that the invincible security apparatus of a dictator can be broken. Putin has spent his entire career depoliticizing the Russian population, convincing them that resistance is futile and that the state is immovable. A successful revolution in Tehran shatters that myth. It shows that when the fear barrier breaks, even the supreme leader is just a man looking for a flight out. Putin cannot afford for his own people to learn this lesson. He needs the Iranian regime to survive not just for the drones, but to prove that the authoritarian model is stable. Every burning police station in Tehran is a spark that could land in the dry tinder of Russian society. This is why the Kremlin is paralyzed by the current crisis. In a normal timeline, Russia might have sent the Wagner Group or special forces to help suppress the uprising, just as they did in Syria or Kazakhstan. But these are not normal times. The Russian military is stretched to its absolute breaking point in the mud of the Donbass and the fields of Zaporizhia. They simply do not have the spare battalions or the logistical bandwidth to intervene in a massive civil conflict in the Middle East. They are watching the fire burn, but their hands are tied. Furthermore, the diplomatic paperwork offers no solution. The Grand Russia-Iran Treaty, for all its talk of strategic partnership, conspicuously lacks a mutual defense clause. Article 5 of NATO says an attack on one is an attack on all. The Russia-Iran deal has no such trigger. Neither side is legally or militarily obliged to save the other from internal collapse. The alliance is transactional, not existential. This leaves the Kremlin with only one card to play: the role of the hospice for fallen dictators. The only security guarantee Putin can offer Khamenei is a guest room in a dacha outside Moscow. This is exactly what happened with Assad. When the palace gates were breached, the only thing Russia provided was an extraction team and asylum. Intelligence reports from the Times in early January indicate that this exact protocol has been activated for the Iranian leadership. The escape plan is real. If the Revolutionary Guards fracture and the security forces defect to the protesters, Khamenei and his inner circle know that Tehran is a trap. The plan is not to fight to the last man. The plan is to flee to the only capital that will still accept their passports. This revelation changes the entire psychological landscape of the uprising. A leader who has a packed suitcase is a leader who has already accepted the possibility of defeat. For the Iranian protesters, this is blood in the water. For the Russian leadership, it is a countdown clock. They are preparing for the arrival of a broken ally, knowing that his arrival marks the beginning of their own end. So, what happens if the unthinkable becomes reality and the regime in Tehran actually collapses? For the Russian Federation, this is not merely a diplomatic inconvenience. It is an economic catastrophe waiting to detonate. If a new legitimate government establishes itself in Tehran and reconciles with the international community, the terrifying consequence for Moscow is the lifting of sanctions. Suddenly, one of the world's largest oil reserves would be unlocked. Millions of barrels of Iranian crude would flood the global market, free from the constraints of the shadow fleet and black market discounts. The laws of supply and demand are unforgiving. This influx would shatter global oil prices, driving the cost per barrel down to levels that the Russian budget cannot sustain. Vladimir Putin's war economy is mathematically dependent on high energy prices to offset the cost of sanctions, and the massive expenditure of the invasion. A liberated Iran would ironically become the financial executioner of the Russian state, competing for the same market share and driving down the very revenue streams that keep the Kremlin's lights on. This is why Russia desperately needs the current theocracy to survive, even as the Iranian people scream for its end. They are trapped in a cynical embrace where the freedom of one nation guarantees the bankruptcy of the other. But the ground reality in Iran suggests that this calculations may already be obsolete. The protests that began on December 28, 2024 were initially sparked by familiar grievances, record inflation, the collapse of the currency, and the daily humiliation of poverty. But within days, the chemistry of the streets changed. This is no longer a movement asking for better wages. It has mutated into a revolutionary demand for the total dismantling of the state. As of January 9th, the unrest has spread to all 31 provinces, turning the entire map of the country into a grid of resistance. At least 62 people have reportedly been killed, including 48 protesters who faced live ammunition with nothing but their voices. The regime has reverted to its standard operating procedure, total information blackout. They have severed the internet and cut international phone lines, plunging millions into digital darkness while accusing the protesters of being foreign agents serving American or Israeli interests. But these accusations ring hollow against the sheer scale of the defiance. The fear that once glued the system together is gone, replaced by a collective realization that the emperor has no clothes, and more importantly, no friends left who can save him. Ultimately, the picture that emerges is one of profound strategic exhaustion. Iran is a broken pillar. Its vaunted network of regional proxies, the ring of fire that once deterred its enemies, has been systematically dismantled or weakened. Its economy is in ruins, its currency is worthless, and its population is in open revolt. Its great power patrons, Russia and China, are either too distracted by their own crises or too cautious to intervene directly. We are witnessing a moment of historical rupture where the axis of autocracy is being tested not by foreign armies, but by the weight of its own failures. The 1,000 drones that vanished in Donetsk and the flight plan sitting in Khamenei's pocket are two sides of the same coin. The inevitable collapse of systems built on fear and endless war. The question is no longer if the change will come, but how violent the transition will be, and whether the shockwave will finally bring down the architects of this chaos in Moscow as well. The tragedy of the people fighting in the streets of Tehran has become the pivot point for the entire global order.